Assalamu alaikum everyone. Welcome back to Project Mansura. For those of you joining for the very first time, my name is Mohammed Abbas Merchant. I am a photographer and filmmaker based in Karachi, Pakistan. This is my podcast where I talk about anything and everything under the sun that catches my attention. Today, I have my very good friend Ashia Hassan on board for a topic that I'm hoping many of you will enjoy, which is basically centered around the critically acclaimed show Brooklyn Nine-Nine. So before we begin, I'm going to kick it over to Ashia so she can introduce herself to you guys. Ashia?
Hi, my name is Ashriya. What's up? Very awkward. I'm sorry about that.
Okay.
Pretty much, yeah. Then
That is all you need to know, that her name.
moving on.
She has a name. Anywho, so today we're going to be talking about how the show Brooklyn Nine-Nine is faced with a very difficult position coming up with their latest season, season 8, wherein the political climate of the world has shifted drastically over just the span of this year, with how the police, although previously held in disdain already, are now more openly being, what's the word? Confronted for their
Criticized?
actions. Yeah, criticized for their actions, right? And then police brutality. So, given shows like Brooklyn Nine-Nine, which are cop dramas, and then shows that paint the cops in, I'd say, a better light than they probably get more often than not, how would you personally think that they should tackle this? Like, how do you think they should be tackling this given the whole situation with George Floyd and then every subsequent person that they have, outright killed in this past year?
I honestly don't know because I think that there's no right way to tackle this, right? So if say they ignore the situation entirely, then that's obviously not good because they're not taking what's happening in the real world into account and continuing to paint this like really rosy picture of what being a cop is like, and that is really damaging to the people who are going to see it and then are going to allow it to shape their perceptions, right? Especially in the US, because I feel like us in Pakistan, we don't really let depictions like Brooklyn Nine-Nine play into our reality so much because that's already so far removed that we
Mm-hmm.
see it as this is a fictional thing and this is what police are like in our country, and that's
Mm-hmm.
completely different.
Mm-hmm.
So, on one hand, they shouldn't ignore it, but then again, if they do address it, and they partially have in the past with that whole episode with Terry, right,
Mm-hmm.
where he got racially profiled by a white cop.
Mm-hmm.
So, that was just a one off instance. But if they do address it in that way
Mm-hmm.
or in a bigger way,
Mm-hmm.
then that is still going to partially give off the depiction oh, some cops are bad, but these characters are people that you've been watching for 7 seasons.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to give that all like not all cops are bad picture to it.
Hmm. Okay. So I think it's very interesting how you pointed out that we as Pakistanis don't really take into consideration things like all of these people, being how cops are actually, because we, knowing Pakistani police, are very, very different from how they're portrayed in the US, right? But I feel like that also brings up a very interesting point in how shows like, let's say, Suits or um, what Crazy Ex-Girlfriend or something like those, right? They also have very different portrayals of real world positions for lawyers, right? But then when you talk to an actual lawyer, they'd probably be really offended at, or even disagree with the portrayals that both of these shows have, right? Because although they're shows and they have some depiction of the law, it's more often than not very dramatized. And I feel like that sort of same principle should be applied to Brooklyn Nine-Nine as well, right? Okay, at the end of the day, it's just a show. I actually had a conversation with a friend of mine wherein they were sharing a meme about how initially when things like these were at their height, people were trying to, de-escalate the situation. They'd be going like, oh, Jake Peralta would never do something like this, right? But then the friend shared that meme and then they were like, oh, listen, if Jake Peralta was a real person, he would most definitely do this because he is a white male. And I think that's where the distinction comes into it, right? He's not a real person. he is a character. And whenever I've thought about this in this sort of context, I've never really thought of Jake or anyone on the show as a real person because, I mean, they're not, right? I've only ever thought of them as just characters I watch on a TV show. I never really associate that to the real world. Similarly to how Suits is just a show, it's not a good depiction or an accurate representation at that of how the system or the people in those positions work. So don't you think a similar sort of approach should be taken for Brooklyn Nine-Nine as well?
Potentially, I just think that it's a little easier for us to consider shows like Suits and Brooklyn Nine-Nine to be in a completely different fictional world. Whereas if we look at something like the drama, like the Pakistani dramas that we have,
Mm-hmm.
we relate more to them, and whatever happens in those shows is sort of plays into our understanding of what reality is in our
Mm-hmm.
social and political climate. So I think that while it is a completely, different fictional universe that all of these characters operate in, if that universe is supposed to reflect your society, like if Brooklyn Nine-Nine is supposed to reflect New York cops in particular, then they need to represent, like, I think they have a responsibility to represent that in a realistic way. Even though they're not, like, obviously they're not bound to, and they can completely go off and say that they operate in a world that is not linked to ours.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and because they're depicting real life circumstances, they have a little bit of a, you know, need to
I
do
mean,
that.
yeah, that's a very interesting point to bring up. But then, don't you also consider the fact that a comedy sitcom, if it comes down to a comedy sitcom to handle issues like racial diversity or police brutality, isn't that? I mean, I personally feel like that's sort of a sad state of affairs to see when a comedy show has to handle things like these and address these sorts of things. I mean, I completely understand that they have to a certain extent because a majority of the sort of demographic that watches these shows are young adults and teenagers, right? People who are very easily affected and impacted by these sorts of things, and they need to be taught if they aren't already aware. So I understand where we're coming from, but then when we also sort of go on the route when a comedy show has to, be the one to educate or be the voice of reason, I personally feel like that's putting a sort of responsibility on someone that it really shouldn't be on. So, what do you think about that?
Absolutely. I think people who write comedy shows didn't really sign on to be purveyors. Is that the right word? To
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
be, contributing to political consciousness and people understanding social reality. But I think media and how it works is a very intricate thing, and obviously all of these issues aren't necessarily being properly depicted by the sources that they should be depicted by, say like news media, newspapers,
Mm-hmm.
actual like journalistic shows and all of that. So if that is already a problem that people are dealing with, then they will probably use other forms of media to understand what's going on. So they didn't sign on for this responsibility,
Mm-hmm.
but they kind of have it now, which sucks, but something they have to deal with, I
It's
think.
interesting that you say that, but then there's also, I feel like, another sort of opposite contrast to this, wherein the superhero show Supergirl by CW,
Mhm.
they are in contrast, although a superhero show, they actually do handle a lot of these sorts of topics that are prevalent in society. They have openly addressed same-sex relationships. They've openly addressed the concept of having a female president for the United States, uh, having racial diversity become a normalized thing. So they've constantly been tackling these sorts of topics of contention, and to a good degree, people have responded like well to those sorts of episodes and those sorts of decisions. But then there's a lot of people who just believe, okay, why are you introducing all of this random crap into my superhero show? I don't really care about racial diversity in Supergirl. I don't care about these sorts of things because even though it's not presented as such, an example of how they handle racial diversity was they'd basically shown that aliens had been living on Earth for a very, very long time, but they'd always hidden their identities. They introduced a new bill that said aliens no longer needed to hide themselves and they could become regular citizens of the United States if they had fled from their home world for XYZ reasons. And they showed that a lot of people revolted against this sort of decision. They believed that aliens should not have a place amongst them. And obviously, that has very clear connotations to what they're referring to. So I feel like it's understandable, right? These are the sorts of things that we're already dealing with on a daily basis through news, through papers, articles. It's everywhere on social media, right? Should it really have a place in our shows as well? And then shows that aren't really linked to these sorts of topics.
I think it's not necessary for shows like Supergirl to say, focus on issues like this in particular. So there's a difference between depiction and actually like addressing issues, right? So if a fantasy show depicts, racial diversity, depicts relationships between different genders, that is great and that makes sense because that fits into their reality. Because who's to say, again, if these other fantasy elements introduce color, then why is the idea of somebody being a person of color or somebody being, non-cis or non-heterosexual is so out of your bubble? So I think depiction is absolutely like necessary to a certain extent because representation does matter in all forms of media. When it comes to addressing issues, they don't have to necessarily because they can just, show a utopia of a world where all of these issues don't exist, and that's fine if they want to do that. But if they can figure out a way to fit it into their the world that they actually have, the way that Supergirl did and the way that X-Men does, then that is really smart. And I think it's not necessarily pushing issues onto people, but letting people who are already dealing with these issues sort of find representation in them and find that, okay, this is a thing that I am dealing with in real life. And it's also a systematic thing that is addressed by my favorite show. And if things maybe turned out fine for them, then maybe they'll turn out fine in real life. I don't know if I answered your question. I completely went off tangent.
No, I got your point. But then don't we also have to consider in shows like X-Men and then Supergirl, all of those people who came out, they were treated as second-hand citizens and to a certain extent were treated with violence as well. Mutants and X-Men.
Which is reality.
Fair enough. But okay, I feel like I'm personally not the right person to address whether or not, how people should go about, being open or identifying themselves because obviously that doesn't, link to me or whatever. But I understand where you're coming from. It would do well to help all of these people who are affected by these claims to feel a little more included and just feel, okay, my favorite TV show is addressed in this manner or my favorite movie is addressed in this manner. I'm not alone. Okay, the people behind these have intentions of allowing us to feel like we're part of something for once rather than being excluded and neglected. So that's very important, and I'm glad you brought it up in that manner. So would this personally affect how you view a TV show?
Whether they have that or not?
Yeah, whether, for example, they're more inclusive of how they're handling racial diversity or, people of color, things like that. And then also how open they are about couples of same sex or, XYZ, stuff like that.
Partially. Okay, so also I thought of something that kind of ties into this. So it also maybe depends on how realistic the show is supposed to be. So with a lot of like superhero movies and superhero shows, we have that like thing in the back of our heads that yes, this is fantasy, but it's also taking place in our world. It's taking place in, our countries and our cities, and normal people are there. And then there's also superheroes, right?
Hmm.
So if, say, Supergirl is taking place in the US, or the X-Men is, or Avengers is taking place in New York specifically, then if that's taking place in our world, then it's going to have issues that our world has. Whereas if we go completely like high fantasy, where the places themselves are completely different, like, say, I don't know, Narnia or something. I
Hmm.
feel like I don't know enough about Narnia. But for instance, if we have our entire world that is completely newly invented and has very little to contrast with our world and very little representation of our world, then if they don't show those issues, then that's fine, because this isn't reality.
Hmm. It's very interesting
If
that
that
you
makes
would
sense.
bring out कि you associate Avengers and these shows that take place on, let's say, Earth with our world, whereas I've personally never done that. Right? I've personally never associated all of these shows going on in my world because although they seem to take place in real cities and have real people, humans, and whatnot, I've never associated felt like, oh, okay, this is my Earth, this is my world, because when you have um, companies like Marvel and DC, they have multiple. They both have their own sort of multiverse theories, right? Marvel has the Infinite Earths. No, sorry, that's DC. They both have their own multiverses, basically, and I've always sort of used that, I think, subconsciously in the back of my head. Oh, this is just another Earth, right? It looks like my Earth, feels like my Earth, but it's not mine. So maybe the issues that they have are very different to mine. So feeling as if these shows have the same sort of circumstances or the same sort of responsibility to handle the real world politics that goes on a daily basis, I feel like is a little unfair because again, it's not their Earth, it's my Earth. And at the end of it, I don't think that people who are making shows about comedy should be tasked with handling matters like racial diversity or police brutality because at the end of the day, that's not what they're doing. How let's put this a little more into context. My Because I feel like my issue being with it is you're essentially asking a plumber to go to space. So although if you look at it from a very weird angle, you could say कि थोड़ा बहुत link है दोनों jobs में. हो सकता है maybe he's going into space to fix
Spaceship
their
के अंदर,
toilet.
yeah,
Yes,
to bathroom, yeah,
maybe, but
maybe.
maybe he's just going there to drill a hole into the moon. I'm looking at you, Armageddon. But you know, it's the logical sense of it. I don't know how difficult it would be to just teach them how to drill. It's not that hard. You just have to make big hole, put bomb in, bomb go boom, and we all fine. All
All
fine.
good.
All Gucci. But it doesn't make sense, right? I'm just like you're trying to make a person whose field is very different from what you're asking them to do, and you're putting them in that sort of position, right? You're asking a comedy writer to handle a very serious topic, but then also have that same show be about comedy. So I feel like you're putting them in a very difficult position because although you and I personally enjoyed the Moo Moo Wala episode, I know people who didn't enjoy it as much, and they did feel it was
Makes
forced.
sense.
Though, which is it's also interesting that Andy Samberg actually went on the record to actually address some stuff as well very recently. I don't know if you've seen that
I
post
don't think
about.
I have.
Yeah, so he basically talked about very similar things. Okay, they're definitely going to be addressing it in a manner that is going to change the overall tone of the show to a certain extent. It's obviously still going to be a comedy cop show, but they do need to take these sorts of things into account. They'd apparently already written the script for the first couple of episodes and they've just been chucked altogether, just chucked all the way. So that does show you that these people do care and they want to do these sorts of things right. So they do care. But again, he went on to say something very similar to my whole point is that you can't expect a comedy cop show to be handling these sorts of issues because that's not their job. I get that people in media and people in film and cinema have a certain job to do right by representation, but that's just the point.
Mm.
At the end of it, if they're doing right just by, let's say, providing a safe working environment for their employees, they're not discriminatory, they're not sexist. I feel like that's good enough, don't you think?
I think to a certain extent, um, I'm not sure honestly, because I do agree that the people in comedy
Mm-hmm.
don't necessarily have the expertise necessary to address
Mm-hmm.
issues like this in very much detail.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that because of the responsibility that they have for their viewers and the part that they play in, shaping public consciousness to a certain extent, they do have a certain responsibility to at least address things, even if it's at a very surface level, so that people can at least look at that and be like, okay, if somebody looks at, say, the Momo episode, which I forgot that that was what it was called, but okay.
I don't
If
think that's
somebody
what it
looks
was
at
called,
the
but that's just how I reference it. The Moo was.
So if somebody looked at that episode and they didn't know the reality of what goes on, maybe they weren't from America, maybe they were from a very privileged bubble, whatever. But if somebody looks at that and says, okay, that's interesting, I'm gonna look more into this because this is clearly something that happens in the lives of cops in the US, then I think at that point the show has done its job. So, talented comedy writers should be able to address real world issues that are going on and still make it funny. And they are able to do that because a lot of comedy is based on observation, it's based on, taking in input from what is going on around you and shaping it in a way that is funny and that is, that talks about a shared experience enough that it allows the viewer to relate and find hilarity in it.
Yeah, that does make some sort of sense to me, and I understand. But बाद I feel like मैं उसी बात पे आके अटक जाता हूँ कि I'm like कि okay, if they can, that's
Mhm.
great, and if they do it well, even better. But they shouldn't have to. They shouldn't have to is the point that I feel like I keep coming back to, because as a filmmaker myself, I make films about sad stuff because that's what appeals to me. You know, I shouldn't have to feel like if I ever get to a point where I've built up a large platform, that it's my job to talk about politics or what's going wrong in the world, because that's not the kind of person I am, or that's not what I'm linked to. Because very recently, I actually saw someone calling out Shahzad Roy because he made a sarcastic post saying, okay, oh, I'm not going to vote next term. I'm just not, because he doesn't believe any of the candidates are worth voting for. They're not doing anything by his own admission, right? He's like, is anyone doing anything for Karachi? And I personally agree to a very large extent. And then people in the comments were bashing on him, saying, "Oh, but you shouldn't say that. You have such a large platform. You should be doing something." Blah blah blah. That's not
Mhm.
his job, dude. Shahzad Roy is an actor. He's a singer. He should not be the one going out and cleaning Karachi or giving talks about why you should clean Karachi or how you should clean Karachi. He shouldn't have to give these solutions. A lot of my biggest issues about people and social media is that if you have a large platform, you're suddenly just this sort of, what is it? You're basically supposed to be able to comment and give solutions and raise your voice about any and every injustice going on in the world. And I personally feel like that's very, very unfair to these sorts of people, right? Because it's not their job. It's the same argument that you're asking a plumber to go represent you in court or something just as ludicrous, right? Okay, you're asking a fashion blogger to talk about politics. You're asking a food blogger to talk about how transgenders don't get enough working opportunities. Sure, they may be very knowledgeable and may actually know how to address those topics, but for a layman, they probably don't, and they probably don't care about it either. जो हमने forced activism करवाना होता है लोगों से, I feel like that's the sort of thing, that the trend that we're slowly moving towards with the shows and films that we watch, and then also the people behind them. And I personally feel like rather than doing good, it's going to produce content that's going to be half-assed at best, and at worst, it's going to just be really offensive. What do you think?
Okay, that was a lot. Um,
Sorry.
I am gonna break that down a little bit. So I think when let's talk about like individuals first, right? So
Mhm.
say bloggers or actors or different YouTubers, whatever it is. I think that having a platform and having people listen to you and having the ability to have an influence over their perceptions and their lives is a very important thing. And you have a lot of power that comes with it. I'm going to bring in the with great power comes great responsibility quote here.
Oof.
Um, so you don't necessarily have a duty to preach to the masses, but you have a responsibility to sort of address things that are important. So,
Mhm.
for instance, if it's an actor or if it's a blogger, I'm not saying that they should, publish a thesis on the rights of transgender people. But if there's a conversation that's going on in, popular society, say if it's the Aurat March happening, or if there's, in the case of the US, if the Black Lives Matter protests are happening, there's already a thing that is going on in your reality, and it is impossible to not have knowledge of it because you know what's going on. Like, आप अंधे तो नहीं बैठे हो ना.
Mhm.
So if that is happening, sure, you don't know about that in depth. Maybe you do. And if you do, great, talk about it. If you don't, uplift people who do. So something that some like YouTubers and influencers did over the course of the like US issues in particular was that they said that they of course did not have the expertise to talk about it, particularly if they were white. And then they said, okay, this person knows what they're talking about. Here's their video, listen to them and read up on this thing to know what the issues are going on and keep yourself informed. And I will be doing the same. Because it's not always your place to contribute to the voices, but it's always your place to, uplift them and amplify them if you can. And
Makes
with
sense.
the Shehzad Roy case, it's again a thing of like if you can't do good, then at least don't do bad, right? If you're not going
Mhm.
to vote, then that's your decision, but don't make that as normalized as you are making it. Like,
Mhm.
don't, because whatever you share on your very public platform has an impact on the people that follow you and the people who respect you and look up to you. So if they're going to look at your thing and go, okay, this guy isn't voting, I guess that's fine. And I won't do that either. Then
Hmm.
that's a little problematic.
I understand where you're coming from with that point, but then isn't it also coming down to the fact that he made it very clear that it's on the basis of the fact that we've had so many political candidates over the past couple of years who've said, oh, मैं ये करूँगा, मैं वो करूँगा, I'll end this, I'll end corruption, I'll clean up Karachi. Karachi's still very, very sadly very far from looking like anything like the metropolitan state that it's supposed to be. I even butchered the word because of how upset I am.
We don't even know
So
what the word is.
I,
That's what it's like.
that's how sad it is. I don't even know what the word is
That's how
supposed
sad
to
it
mean.
is.
Like when you compare
Mhm.
Karachi to places like Islamabad or Lahore, with the amount of people that we have, I mean, it's a very sad thing to say that Karachi should be looking much better than it does. Karachi has a stupid amount of people that are there, like in its population, but it hardly gets the sort of attention that it needs, and then the support that the economy needs, because it's very difficult for people in Karachi because this is one of the closest options for people coming from the rural areas to find work. But yet we don't have proper housing, we don't have proper drainage systems, we don't have jobs. A majority of people that are living in Pakistan are going through daily difficulties of power outages, water outages, and one of the biggest issues that we're going to face in winters is no gas. We already don't have any central heating, but then if we don't have gas, that means चूल्हे नहीं चलेंगे, आपके geysers नहीं चलेंगे. you're effectively going to leave people in very, very difficult circumstances. And this happens every year. It's not even like it's once a year or maybe एक साल छोड़ के ऐसे. It's every single year. It's the same routine. गर्मियों में load shedding, सर्दियों में gas के problems. So it's issues like these that really, really do upset me. I feel like it all comes down to the fact that we're always stuck in situations where there will always be problems, but then the authorities who should be in charge, who should be taking action, never do. And we're always looking towards people who do a little bit of good in their positions of power or their positions of authority, but then they're not the authorities who should be doing this in the first place. It's not Wasim Akram's job to clean up CVU with his wife. That's CBC's job, and they should be doing it.
No, no, absolutely, I agree with you. And with the, I mean, I don't know the intricacies of what the Shahzad Roy situation was. I think it's perfectly justified in his frustration, in the idea that no matter who he votes for, there is a certain complacency that is part of like every single political party that could potentially win. And if there is no way to actually make a difference, then you can get the idea that your vote doesn't count and maybe it doesn't. Right? So with his personal decision, I completely understand that. I don't really know what the impact of him broadcasting it would be. So I don't know if I'm at like liberty to speak on it because I don't know if people would already, agree with him, and or if they would see the information he shared and then go like, okay, I thought that I should vote, but I guess I won't. Like, I don't know if that's going to change their minds or if their minds are already made up to, go along with what he already is doing. So, I don't know.
I mean, yeah. In conclusion, yeah. So I think we've had a very good discussion on how there's the shift of responsibility that we're often doing consciously or subconsciously. It's done with good intentions, but at times it does put the responsibility on people's shoulders who it really shouldn't belong to. And although we as individuals do have a certain duty to uphold, to call out injustice wherever we see it and do whatever we can to make it right in society, I feel like it is a little unfair to expect it from every single person who has a platform, because again, the people that should be dealing with these sorts of issues don't. So that shift of blame and responsibility is unfair. So although we should be doing what we can, it shouldn't just be us as individuals. It shouldn't just be, celebrities, bloggers, or even, actors or whatever, right? It shouldn't just be the responsibility. The responsible authorities and then the people who are causing these issues or these problems should be held accountable. So, yeah.
I think also when we were talking about media representation and how that can often go wrong because the people that are obviously writing these shows maybe don't have the necessary experience or the necessary ability to depict it in a way that is not stereotypical, that is not that doesn't seem like it's pushing something onto the viewers and makes it very like normalized. But I think what also counts is just having diversity in your writing rooms and having diversity in your directors chairs and all of that, because फिर आपका subconsciously हो जाता है ना, like if you have representation in your team of writers, for instance, then they automatically write a show that is very socially aware and that incorporates that social awareness into whatever its actual theme might be, whether that's comedy, whether that's fantasy. It can't help but do it because these people are shaped by their experiences, and then their experiences shape their art and shape the output of their work.
So yeah, I think that's a very interesting point that you make. When you put your creators and your writers and your people in those such situations, they are more mindful and they are more aware, which is smart, really, and actually does make sense to a very good extent. And yeah, I do agree it does put them in those sorts of situations. So I mean, yeah, I think the takeaway is always just going to be more mindful of the situations and then the way that the world is evolving. And of course, you are under a certain sort of position of, what is it called? Political awareness, political speech, something, right? When you have a position of power or you have a certain fan following, you are under a certain responsibility to be mindful of what you say and how you say it. But that doesn't mean you should start preaching about how people should live their lives or whatever. Because sometimes when that sort of advice comes from the wrong sort of platform or the wrong sort of person, that's just taken negatively as well.
Yeah,
So
of course. Obviously, don't speak on issues that you don't have enough knowledge of,
mhm,
because as bad as it is to not say anything, it's also worse to say the wrong thing and lead people down a completely different path. And yeah, just make sure that if you are contributing to the conversation, if you're informed enough, do it yourself. If you're not, then allow others to do it and allow them to maybe use your platform in a way to reach to more people and just, uplift the things that need to be uplifted.
mhm. And yeah, I do agree with that in the same sense. Don't talk about things that aren't, from your field, from your platform. Very similarly to how literally every other person is an expert on the pandemic and the virus and how they're all doctors now. They all done their PhDs and everything, and they all just know, oh, it's fine. It's just a
Panadol
cold.
Club.
पैनाडोल खाओ. लेकिन सबसे पहले तो आपने घबराना नहीं है. ये सिर्फ एक जुकाम है. And we're all
Sure.
fine. We're all fine. It's all
Because
great.
either is a calm, yeah, it is a very targeted intervention by the Chinese government to kill everyone.
This is all
You
just
can't
Bill
have
Gates'
both.
plan to insert chips into our bodies. And you know what? I was always against 5G. It's all bad. We should all throw away our phones. And it's all bad. ये सब यहूदी साजिश है, मैं तो बोल रहा हूँ.
Agree.
And we should all throw our phones away and go back to the Stone Age.
जो बात है.
ये सारी बीमारियों में वो सब कुछ भी नहीं था, सब सही था.
हाँ, उस वक्त कौन सी बीमारियां थी? Oh my god.
Exactly. It's not like the plague was a thing.
Exactly. You can't be shocked at people dying if you already have a life expectancy of like 30. You know?
Exactly. So yeah, that was a very, very interesting conversation. I believe my most politically charged episode to date. And yeah, I think, do you think you have anything to
Which is
add?
ridiculous because I know absolutely nothing.
I mean, we both, I mean, you took a class on like political something, something. You took a class.
I had social in A
हाँ
levels.
हाँ
That's
वही
like
वही.
the extent of my.
Yeah. You also took one in like
And like
last
I
year, na?
spent a lot of time on Tumblr. Like that's
Exactly.
the
So
extent.
and like my extent is like basically whatever Shazad Khayas, is that his name? The dude on
Yes,
Facebook.
yeah.
The dude on Facebook. Whenever he writes posts, that's like my,
The dude on Facebook.
yeah, the dude on Facebook. You know what I'm talking about. So that's my extent of political knowledge or whatever. So did we just contradict ourselves by saying that entire thing that we probably shouldn't have been talking about this in the first place?
Like what? Oh, yeah. Little bit.
It's fine. I'm a
But then
YouTuber.
again, everything that I did mention has been like said by people who probably are smarter than I am.
Smartness,
So,
smartness is subject.
what subject? Math?
I hope not. If it is, I'm failing, dude. Shut up, you're good at math.
If smartness is math, then I haven't been smart since freshman year, and I'm perfectly fine with that.
Shut up. Anyways, so yeah, I think that just about wraps up this episode. Do you want to plug any of your social media or anything on here that people can find you on?
I have a public Instagram at pretentious.rambling that I don't use at all, and I'm not promising you anything, but you can go check that out if you want.
Awesome. So yeah, I think that just about wraps it up for this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you would like us to talk about anything else in particular, do feel free to leave it down in the comments below. If you would like to have, if you want me, I keep messing up the outros to this, good God. If you would like me to have someone on board that you
Do you have a
know
name for your
personally,
fans?
I do not. Guys, also, if you have any suggestions on what you'd like to be called, leave it down in the comments below.
Abbassinators?
On that happy note, we are going to cut this episode short. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, and stay tuned for more. Thank you guys for tuning in, and we will see you guys in the next episode. Take care, everybody. Bye bye.